I'll start by saying that I'm very aware of the fact that this whole series of lectures is about mindfulness and meditative practice in psychology and therapy. And but how this practice has originated, from where it comes, what is the source, this is my interest. And the reason I'm standing here is this number of Sukh and Logos, which some of you are already familiar with, and it's almost a year back. So it was in October. It was in October 2010 that it was possible to send abstracts for getting published in this number of Sukh and Logos, and the topic was mindfulness and meditation. And I attempted to send my abstract. It was accepted, and then I sent this article in the month of January, and it was returned to me 2 or 3 times. There was some very strict referee who came with very constructive comments, and after correcting my presentation, my article 3 times, it finally got published, and this is the last article in this series, in this journal. And we had this conference on 30th of August in DPU, in Denmark's Pedagogisk University, where the authors were invited to present shortly their own article, and one other article we were supposed to comment on. And there I met Anas, and I got invited here. So this is shortly about why I'm here this evening, and a little longer introduction about myself and my own this meeting between East and West. As you can almost guess originally from which country I come. Can you guess this? I think I use a very clear symbol here to point out. It was in 1980. I came from north of India to Denmark, and I came with this first degree. You can see MSc in one of these titles. I know it's not very Danish to use these titles, but I think it's part of my identity, my professional identity. So I came with this degree in Master of Science from Delhi University in a subject which is equivalent to developmental psychology, and then I studied psychology in Copenhagen University, and then I got this degree of Sukh. And then I studied further and got my PhD from Copenhagen University. And then I started in Roskilde University. I have been a psychologist all along, and I have worked for a number of years in Copenhagen city as a clinical psychologist before I came to Roskilde University. And along with this, I am also involved in a little NGO where we do partly volunteer work with minority youth and their families. And about this topic, it's not only the theoretical aspects of this meeting. When people move across boundaries, and when knowledge moves across boundaries, then some sort of processes take place, and there are some developments. And this is about diffusion of knowledge. My presentation will be about diffusion of knowledge, and I'd like to start with a few lines from an article in Times of India, one of the leading Indian newspapers, which says that diffusion is the law of nature. It takes place where there is inequality and non-uniformity. Since our world has plenty of these above traits, diffusion is bound to happen. And consider the diffusion of knowledge. Knowledge developed at one place must diffuse to place devoid of it. This helps to spread and contributes to its growth. So this is about an understanding of this globalized world where not only people, but knowledge is also moving across the borders. But when we talk about this movement of knowledge, sometimes the sources are forgotten. And why I am bringing this issue up, because being associate professor in Roskilde University, one of the duties I have is to be censor for master's dissertation from other universities in Denmark, And in the last few months, at least in last year, I have been censor for a number of master dissertations from other universities, and some of them are about mindfulness, mindfulness as a practice, mindfulness as a technique, and in some of them written by young, intelligent psychology students in other part of Denmark. It seems that mindfulness is a a process, a psychological intervention form which is started by Kabat-Zinn in USA. They almost forget from where mindfulness started, how it started. It has become, because now I'll be coming to this part later, who started it in the Western world and how it got popular, that young, enthusiastic, bright psychology students in Denmark are writing number of master's dissertation about it. And this is one of the reasons that my article in this Sukh and Logos is exactly about this phenomena. I call my article Origins of Mindfulness and Meditation. From where does it originate? And this is where this title comes in, because this origin of mindfulness brings us to this interplay of Eastern and Western psychology. So I hope those who came here to hear more about mindfulness do not feel very left out or cheated by seeing this title, because there is this connection between this title about mindfulness, a meditative practice, and my God, it has disappeared. This is what Buddhism is about. Everything is impermanent. Nothing is permanent. Everything can disappear anytime. So this has happened. But we have some technology and we have honors here. So it comes back. And that's also part of life and part of this philosophy, that what disappears can come back sometime. So with this we start. And what I'll try to do in the next hour or so is that I will introduce Eastern and Western psychological orientations. And then I will focus on major aspects of psychology, especially the aspects of Eastern psychology which are directly related to these meditative practices. What is it which characterizes Eastern psychology? And with that, I will be talking of interfaces, interplay between Eastern and Western psychology, where one of the major examples will be these practices. And these practices in the Western context. And then I'll try to conclude, although it's very difficult to conclude in such a complex phenomena which is growing, and then talk about some perspectives. And I have been told by Anas that we have a break around 8 o'clock. Is that right? So I plan to continue. I hope you can be here mentally present. It's mindfulness, so you can be here mindful and not without mind till 8 o'clock. Then we have 10 minutes break and we'll continue. I'll continue for maybe 10 minutes more. And then we have the last 30 minutes or so for questions and discussions. And as it was pointed out, I chose to make this presentation in English because most of the text and literature is in English. But I'm using both English and Danish as a language of teaching in my job in the university. So if there is some point you do not understand in English, please stop me. I will try my best to explain it in Danish if you feel it's not clear in English. And your questions can also be in Danish. And if there's some point which is not clear, you are welcome to stop me. Otherwise, we have the last hour for comments and discussions. So with this, I'd like to start. What is psychology? Because somebody says, oh, is there psychology in India, in other parts of the world? Is it psychology a Western construction? It depends how you define psychology. If psychology is defined as a systematic and scientific study of person, then psychology is in many forms, and what is systematic and what is scientific is also under discussion. There is no one part of world who has patent on defining psychology or what is scientific. There are different understandings of scientific, the concept scientific. So with this starting point for psychology, we can say that Eastern psychological knowledge is more than 3,000 years old. And it is in this religious and philosophical documents. And what characterizes Eastern psychology is more holistic and inclusive concept, where focus is both on consciousness, mind and body. And as compared to this, now it's nice for me that some of my colleagues and some of my old students are also here. So I have to be a little careful what I'm saying. But I'll say that in some ways, when we talk of Western scientific psychology, then we can say there is a birthday and there is a European father of psychology and there is an American father of psychology. Unfortunately, no mothers. So the feminist women, and myself included, will feel why psychology has only fathers and not mothers. That's another issue. We can have another lecture some other time. But William Wundt from Germany is regarded as the European father of modern psychology from 1860, and William James, those who are from this discipline can recognize him as the American father of modern psychology. So in some ways, we can say that it's 150 years or so, this modern. But on the other hand, we have to remember that although it is relatively new, this modern Western psychology, it is also built on European philosophy, medicine and religious traditions. And Steiner Quayle, one of the professors of psychology whose dad has written a very provocative article about the placing of religion in Western psychology, and he says that even Western psychology is very much affected by the religious understandings in the West, and especially Protestant religion. So this is some sort of background, and of course it's a very complex discipline we are talking about. It's a simple sort of understanding, and with this we can say that when we focus on this Eastern orientation of psychology, what is it and what sort of development has taken place in Eastern understanding of psychology. So it has been very much affected by this cultural imperialism, especially the continent I'm talking about Indian psychology. It has been affected by this cultural imperialism, and the colonial past has done that for some centuries, the ancient psychological knowledge was suppressed, and it did not develop as it should have been developed. So this makes that, this brings us to the point that the Indian psychology is based on systems of Hindu philosophy, Upanishads. There is yoga system, Ayurvedic system, and meditation practices are a part of what we can regard as Indian psychology. And when I use the term Indian psychology, it is not narrow geographical concept. It is not India as a political entity, but it is a broader concept. It is about the concept which started in that geographical area, and Buddhism is a very important part of Indian psychology. And when I was studying psychology in late 70s in India, there was no book like this, but in 2008, this is one of the first books published dealing with this deeper understanding of psychology, Handbook of Indian Psychology, and I'll be using some citations from this book. And according to this book, when we regard Buddhism, and which will later lead to this mindfulness practice, this Buddhism practice developed further. It started, Buddha was born and brought up in Nepal and India that time, the thousands of years back. But this practice developed in Sri Lanka, Tibet and Japan, and Jain Buddhism is also developed in Japan. So in some ways, when we use this term Indian psychology, we are talking of a broad sort of understanding, and these theories, and it offers you fruitful theories and practices. Indian psychology, and it's not only relevant, it's not just indigenous psychology for that part of world, but it is offering theories and understandings which have pan-human interest. And this developing use of mindfulness and meditative practices in West sort of confirm this, that this practice, that some of the theories and practices have interest for human beings on the whole. And now I'll be doing something which is rather criticable in some ways. I'll be comparing the two systems, and it is a simplification. When we want to compare something, we look at the main features. Of course, there are many variations, many different orientations within these Eastern and Western psychology also. But what characterizes this Eastern psychology as depicted by Indian psychology is that religion, philosophy and psychology are not separated. There is much more closeness between these subjects and a more integrated approach to knowledge, and it is believed that understanding of reality is not possible if knowledge is just put into watertight compartments. So with this, sometimes these very strict lines between different disciplines become difficult, and in some ways it suits me fine that I am working in Roskilde University, where we have much more mixing of subjects. In some other universities, these divisions are much more sharp. And coming back to the Western psychology, of course, it is a simple definition of Western psychology. It is that Western psychology has a reductionistic framework where there is sharp division between mind and body on one side, material and spiritual, and sometimes there is also this conflict between religion and science. But thankfully, seen from my point of view, thankfully these so-called mainstream psychology, which is highly inspired by the American psychology, and APA, American Psychological Association, a very powerful organization with 100,000 members. It is sort of being challenged, and this univocalism is turning to other approaches like hermeneutic or interpretive inquiry, and there is more theoretical pluralism. So maybe I am also reducing Western psychology to this mainstream, a sort of simplified mainstream psychology, because there are these divisions between mind and body. These dichotomies are being challenged by subjects such as, by disciplines, subdisciplines within psychology, such as your own forum here, existential psychology, this cultural psychology, social constructionism, critical psychology and critical theory. So there is this sort of challenging these divisions, but still the hegemony within the mainstream psychology is characterized by these dichotomies. So with this, we will like to see what is there, what is happening in Eastern orientation of psychology, what sort of contents are there, what is being studied, and in some ways it is practical, this Eastern orientation, and there is focus on both understanding, knowing and being, and knowledge is something which liberates. Knowledge is used for emancipation, for liberation, and man, society is concerned with man's harmony with fellow beings, with the society, nature and cosmos. So there is a lot of focus on interconnectedness and also harmony with the nature. And with this, now this is the simplified understanding of Western psychology. It is about explaining, predicting and controlling behavior. And there is also analyzing and gathering knowledge, and knowledge is not used for, knowledge is sort of seen as power. This is a familiar sort of concept, knowledge is power, and this relationship is between man and society. And it is concerned, very much concerned with personality, with personality's growth of individual. And at the same time, you can say if there is so much emphasis on the individual, is it some sort of sanction for selfishness? If it's just the individual, just the person, then is it sort of accepting selfishness? And of course, I know there are a lot of discussions. Some of my own colleagues in the department are discussing this tension between individualism and solidarity with a larger collective. But these are some of the characteristics. And then we come to this classic Asian system. What are the sort of methods being, what are the goals of Eastern psychology and what are the methods, and it is combining this objective and subjective instance, and mind is seen as material and mind is seen as an instrument between consciousness on one side and body on the other side. So, mind has a spatial sort of position, but at this, and there are different levels of consciousness. It is not only the conscious level. Awake stages we are focusing at, there are many different and altered stages of consciousness, which is very closely related to meditation, also becomes a part of Eastern psychological understanding. And what are the ideals of mental health? Who is a healthy person according to this Eastern understanding of psychology? And this is about harmony and social integration. So, a healthy person is a person who is in harmony and who shows social integration, balance, functioning and protection and care. And this is, I can recommend by a psychiatrist, Suman Fernando, this book about mental health, race and culture. He is originally from Sri Lanka. He has lived almost 50 years of his life in England. And this is third edition of this book, which I can recommend if somebody wants to go closer and more from a psychiatric point of view, because in a very simple way he is presenting these ideals of mental health with harmony. And if we contrast them with simply with the mainstream Western psychology, first it is the objective stance which is important. Secondly, it is also objects of consciousness, not consciousness as such, but objects of consciousness, and not all these stages of consciousness, but the wakeful states which are important. And thankfully now there is some research being done in sleep processes. In Denmark itself there are some clinics which are studying sleep and what is happening in the sleep, but mostly the weight is on wakeful states. And the ideals of mental health, here comes there some sort of contrast, is on self-sufficiency and personal autonomy. Can you recognize these terms? Are they making sense? Or it's just some abstractions I am just explaining here? Yeah, so for the hvis vi siger, at i den østlige forståelse, der er meget vægt på bevidsthed. Og hvad er bevidsthed som en proces, som et fænomen? Men inden for mainstream, inden for vestlig psykologi, så det er objekter af bevidsthed. At hvor er det hen, man retter sin opmærksomhed? De der objekter bliver vigtigt, og ikke processer som sådan set. Og derfor det er motivation og hvad ligesom object relation teorier og sådan noget. Så det der bliver vigtigt, ikke fænomen sådan set. Consciousness as such. Så det er der forskel kommer. Men hvad kan vi bruge alt det her til? Og hvad sker der, at hvordan siger vi mennesker, når vi siger, fordi nu vi kommer tættere på den her definition of psychology, some wooden man first to mennesker. Now I have to come back to English. So humans are capable of, so what is important is that direct experience becomes very important in the Eastern psychology. It is the subjective experience of the person which becomes important. And there are some approaches within the mainstream Western psychology which do not want to think of subjectivity, where the objectivity is so important. And then what are human beings capable of? And here I will use my mother tongue. My mother tongue is Hindi, which is derived, which is very close to Sanskrit, and some of these scriptures are in Sanskrit. So they say, according to this understanding, sense-driven learning, human beings are capable, human beings have lot of capability, and one of them is Shravan. Shravan means hearing. So human beings can hear, human beings can manan. Manan means reasoning, they can reason. And what is not usually considered in Western psychology is also about nidhyasan, meditative knowledge, intuitively obtained realization. There is also this capability. And this is a first person experience. Sometimes it is difficult to explain, and the experiences are they can be overwhelming, and sometimes it is too great to be described in words. These experiences, these intuitive experiences, these meditative knowledge is sometimes so difficult to describe because it's not describable, and that's where there is some sort of tension in presenting these experiences to the others, and also some of the altered states of consciousness are difficult to present. So with all this, you must be saying, my God, we've come to hear about mindfulness and meditation and why we are getting all this knowledge. How many of you are psychologists, by the way, or studying psychology? Okay. So some of you can sort of recognize what I am presenting here, but for others maybe it was not so interesting. So I am trying to sum up. So what I am saying, and here I have to thank this blind referee, not blind without eyes, but very awake referee for my article, who made me aware, because the first version of my article in this journal was more broad about these understandings which I have presented to you up till now. But I got these comments that what characterizes this psychology and what characterizes a person in this Indian psychology, in this Eastern psychological knowledge. And with this, now I am grateful. It was very difficult when you get your article back. Some of you have this experience that you've used many hours to write an article, and you have somebody to help you with the language, and then when you think, oh, it's done, and you finish something, it comes back, and there are a lot of comments, and there were also some very harsh criticism. But thankfully, along with this harsh criticism, there were also some constructive suggestions, and these suggestions have led me to these three major assumptions. I do not know who that person was, but that person was constructive, and so these points have been very useful for me to understand what I was trying to convey through all those slides up till now, that what is it which characterizes these assumptions and which is forming basis for both Buddhism and yoga practices. Because this is what is the basis of mindfulness and meditative practices. And the first part is that this monoism between, there is more closeness between mind and body, and it was Descartes in if you go back to the Western philosophical understanding, so it was in 1600 or 1500, maybe my colleague can help me. Descartes, who said that mind and body are sort of this dichotomy. What century was it?
1630.
Oh, 1630. So it's almost 400-500 years back, and that's where because what was it? I can't remember the Latin words, but I think this is why I'm a human being. It translates something like that. So there was this dichotomy between mind and body became very characteristic for this Western thinking. But what characterized this Eastern thinking is this monoism instead of this dualism. There is this closeness between mind and body, and also this holism, which is underpinning thinking about a person, that this harmony and this closeness both with nature and with the social beings, and also with cosmos at a very high level. So there is this monoism, which is, and this is one major assumption. And second, and this is why the practices I'll be talking about, there is no separation, because when you are doing yoga exercises, how many of you have done or still practice yoga? Are there some of you? A number of you. So is it something only for your body, or it's also for your mind? You know, there is this unity, this dichotomy is not there in these practices. So this is one of the first assumptions. And the second assumption is this centrality of consciousness. And this is what I was trying to explain in other way. I was introducing this, that it's not the objects of consciousness, but consciousness as such. It becomes a very central concept, and it's not just strengthening of your own ego, but it is this sort of awareness which becomes important. And this phenomenology of consciousness provides both for transactional learning, which is more about with your near surroundings, and also about transcendental, about the spiritual experiences. So there is basis both for transactional learning with your near surroundings and also with the spiritual sort of experiences, transcendental experience, and also personal transformation, which also makes Indian psychology sort of positive psychology. Now I am not talking about positive psychology from Seligman as such, but there is this positive aspect that human beings have potential and human beings can be transformed. So this is the second point. And this third point, which is rather controversial, and in some settings it really arouses lot of it provokes people, because meditation is not seen as a technique, or it is seen as a part of daily conduct. And that's where some people feel very restless. Oh, isn't mindfulness something only when you are stressed, then you can use mindfulness? Only if you have some eating disorders, then you can use mindfulness. Are there not such ideas? And now I just recently got to know, if you are without a job, if you are unemployed and you are living in Copenhagen area, you are offered courses by this job center. Both you are offered courses in positive psychology, you get some sort of coaching, and you are even invited for mindfulness courses. So there this tension comes, because focus, it's very important to have focus on meditation as a part of daily conduct. And then there is this whole issue. The comments I got when in this conference in DPU about my article was that on one level I am talking of these practices as spiritual consciousness, but in some Western context, I am not saying in a narrow sense, if you take these practices of mindfulness, meditation, yoga practices, they become some sort of self-technologies. So what is the purpose? What is happening here? And this I will be discussing later. I can see the time is passing. So, but what is, I have talked about this, I have not gone so much into the history, and I don't know how many of you are members of this forum for existential psychology? Not so many, because if you are not, then I will really recommend this website, because there is an excellent essay about the history of meeting between East and West, and the author is standing there taking this video, making this video film, where he explains this historically. There are 4 phases in this meeting, this historical interplay between East and West. And I am not going into this whole historical, I will just recommend that you read this article if you are interested. But what is important is that there have been meetings between the East and West. The Eastern knowledge has been used even by 2-3 centuries back, when this is the positive side of British colonialism, when some of these Hindu scriptures were translated into English, then they were used by some philosophers in the West. And I cannot, how you pronounce his name? Schopenhauer. So, and some other philosophers have been using these Indian concepts, but from psychological point of view, what is interesting that there are some psychologists like Carl Jung, who traveled in the late 19th century, in 1880s or something like that, to West, and they got knowledge from there. So on one side there is this Western psychology, but on the other side there have been these meetings, and now I have told you about Kabat-Zinn, which some students think just started this whole mindfulness. So in some ways there is this interaction going on, but what is the situation now? In 2010 and 11, we are sort of dividing between Eastern and Western psychology. But what is happening, and I still have connection with my first university in New Delhi, and in July I was in New Delhi. I was invited for a lecture in my old university, and there I was quite fascinated by the focus on the cognitive psychology. That in some ways Asian psychology is getting more westernized, and there is a lot of focus on these Western models and cognitive approaches in some universities there, but still this spiritual dimension is there, and also this secular ethic where religion is not being rejected, but there is a respect for religions. And in West, I think there is this Western psychology, especially some particular evidence based, those who are in this psychological field know these evidence based approaches and methods are getting very popular and are having a hegemonic position, but still there is this influence of Eastern psychological knowledge. But now I will try to see what is happening in this interface, how these two orientations are meeting, and for this I will go back, I will go almost 80 years back, and I think everybody is familiar with Sigmund Freud here. Freud, when you choose to use your evening on such a day, on a dark evening, you come here, then you are familiar with Sigmund Freud. And one of the followers of Freud was Carl Jung, who traveled to East. And what he says here is in some ways bringing out this desire to get knowledge, and also what I started with, this diffusion of knowledge. Some parts are devoid of some knowledge, and this knowledge comes from some other parts. And all of you can read this. I think I won't read it aloud. I will give you a minute or so to read this. Is it making some sense? Can you recognize this? It is almost, we can say it's 70 plus 80 years old statement, but in some ways this sort of desire to find something which was inside the inner man, and also when the language can be very different, this wisdom, and I think it was the last lecture in this series. How many of you attended the last lecture on 26th of October? Were some of you there? And it was from, that center is called Center of Wisdom. What is it called? Can you remember it? Mindfulness. Yes.
Center for Wisdom and Compassion.
Yes, Center for Wisdom and Compassion. So there is this sort of wisdom, there is this, this need to have access to this wisdom from the East, and it appeals in some ways, and even when this language is difficult to understand, but there is this appeal for this sort of this wisdom, this understanding. But in what forms? What happens when you think of it, and what is this wisdom? And this is again this wisdom and this compassion and connectedness. And if we go back to those concepts which seemed like very abstract and maybe a little boring, those concepts about harmony, this connection and this harmony with others. And this Hall is one of the Western interpreters of Buddhism, and for him this is one of the main principles of Buddhism. And this Eastern knowledge, that kindness that comes from heart is every man's bridge with all that lives. It sounds too idealistic, doesn't it? It's every man's bridge with all that lives. So it's not only about other human beings, but it's all that lives with all living beings in some ways. So this brings us to this point of compassion and interconnectedness. And with this, I'll just start shortly with this some principles of Buddhism. And it was a real pleasure for me. I've been teaching in Denmark for last 20-25 years, and this was first time I could write something in Sanskrit, my original language, because otherwise it won't make sense when I'm talking of psychological problems of youth or family relationships, and or sometimes talking about health problems. But here it made sense, and I like to read it. Chatvari Adi Satyani. This word in Sanskrit is Chatvari Adi Satyani, which means the four noble truths. And how is it? I'm not going into life history of Buddha or anything like that, but these are the principles which guide these practice of mindfulness and meditation to some extent. And these are the four noble truths, and it is about this suffering which in some way is closer to a lack of satisfaction. When you are not satisfied, that life cannot be just a perfect bliss, it cannot be just happiness, there is some sort of suffering all the time in life. And some people will say it's like this conflict theories, that there will always be conflict, there will be some sort of imbalance. So there is this dukh or suffering, and the cause of suffering is craving and clinging. And also the principle I almost stated before about changing, that nothing is permanent. You are attached to some object, you have attachment to something, and this attachment cannot just continue because it changes, because everything changes. This is in some ways seen as law of impermanence, not law of permanence, but law of impermanence. And there is also this craving and achieving and the three roots of evil are called greed. And this, I think, is in many different spiritual understandings all over the world about greed, hatred and delusion, about greed and hatred. And also about this nirvana, which is a very characteristic thinking in this Eastern understanding, both in Buddhism and in Hinduism also, that there is this circle of life and death, reincarnation, and to get out of it. Now nirvana is not this music band. It became very popular, wasn't it? Some American music band called Nirvana. It's not, and many of us from India, many Hindus and Buddhists thought it was a wrong sort of word to be used by a music group which was not following these paths at all, which was going on totally different path. But there was no patent. Buddha or Indians had no patent on the term nirvana, so it became like this term. It was used or misused by this. And what is important here is this eightfold path, how to get out of it, and everybody could not get this nirvana. So Buddhism also shows you a path. It's called Noble Eightfold Path. It's this eightfold path which shows a way of leading a life which is sort of the right sort of life to live. And with this, I think we need a break now, all of us. So you can the term mindfulness, how this term came in and where is it used in Buddhistic literature. Now we are coming to this point, because Buddha, I think, was quite sensible in some ways. He knew that for ordinary people living everyday lives, ordinary lives, nirvana was almost unattainable. So he came with this idea of this Noble Eightfold Path, and this is sort of divided into three different, this eightfold path has three main points. One is about wisdom, about ethical conduct, and about concentration. And now we will be looking at this eightfold path, where first time this term right mindfulness is being used. Mindfulness term is being used. But what is important and what is my main message in this presentation is that we have to look at the whole package instead of just looking at one point. And this is that under wisdom are the qualities of right view and right intention. So this is one of the first aspect of this eightfold path, right view and right intention. And at the same time, of course, you can say that what sort of intention, and also about the historical period. It's 500 years before Christ, so it's almost 2600 years back these scriptures were first formulated. But there is this focus on right view and right intention, and also right speech and right action, and also right livelihood. And I don't think any of you sitting here are working as butchers, but if you read the detailed scriptures, then some professions and also selling of your own body, and like prostitution, and the working as butcher and all is not regarded as right livelihood. But these are these aspects which involved in ethical conduct, that how you behave yourself should be ethical. So the first point was about wisdom, the second point is about this ethical conduct, and then it's under this third group of when we are talking of this path, is this this concentration are the paths involving right effort, right mindfulness and right concentration. So it is right mindfulness, it's this being present there. I will be going into details. So that's one aspect which has been taken, and I will be going in some details, but please look at this slide carefully, and these are the this is eightfold path, and what is happening in some of the narrow definitions and understandings of mindfulness. We can look at a narrow understanding of mindfulness, and we can have this broader understanding of this whole phenomena. And what is happening, that the term mindfulness is being used, and even if we go back to this history, this short Western history of mindfulness term, then we can say that it was Kabat-Zinn. I don't know if I am pronouncing his name correctly, Kabat-Zinn, how do you, Kabat-Zinn, from Massachusetts Institute in the USA. Luckily, I will say that it is lucky in some ways that in 60s and 70s he came in contact with some Buddhist monks, and there he got this knowledge, and it was in 1974. It is also described in this essay I had recommended. 1974, I think this book was published about miracles of mindfulness, and somehow this whole idea appealed, and this is in some way, it's a fortunate, from some angle we can regard it as a fortunate meeting between this Eastern wisdom and Western understandings, that Kabat-Zinn, he was in some ways wise enough to use these understandings, but maybe consciously, or maybe he learned from the other experiences, because before it in 50s and 60s there were Alan Watts in Zen Buddhism, in other forms, Eastern knowledge was being used, but maybe consciously he avoided words like meditation, he avoided words like spirituality, and he used these ideas of being in present and this concentration, or in some simple ways it can be called attention training for stress reduction. So he started this clinic in late 70s, and he called it, he didn't use these terms which usually are being used to characterize these phenomena. And some people will say it was wrong, that it was too reductionistic, but in other ways it at least opened some doors. It opened some doors, and it also made it possible to be recognized in the idioms, in the forms which are recognizable in the Western world, because he used these standard, the golden rule of the golden practice of RCT. Can you guess what I am hinting at? Randomized controlled trials. in the natural sciences, if you want to sort of get your interventions, form or medicine or something accepted, so it has to be subjected to rigorous scientific ways seen from natural scientific angles and randomized clinical trials. So in some ways he used this terminology, this idiom of natural sciences to bring in these practices, and it has, in some ways it has been popular, and now we can see it was in 1998. It is mentioned here. I wrote a little article in a magazine. It came as a chronic in the newspaper Information about this meeting between East and West 13 years back. I think it was too ahead of times. People thought she's crazy. She's talking of knowledge from East coming and being used. But I was not the only one. Already in 1930s, Carl Jung had this vision, which is also described in the essay, where he thought that it could be useful to bring knowledge from East and combine it with the understandings in West. So the ideas have been there, and in some ways it is being used. And how do we understand this mindfulness? So now those who really came to hear about mindfulness, now the focus is coming there. It is this is a behavior of moving and sharpening the focus of awareness within the field of consciousness. And it is also related to this compassion and as a universal human capacity, reminding us that we are all human beings, and for greater health, happiness and freedom. So mindfulness becomes this movement of living in now and not focusing so much on the past history, and trying to concentrate, and in a simplistic manner, you can say that it is some sort of attention, training of your own attention, and you are trying to live in that movement and sort of disciplining yourself. But what are we doing if we have just this very narrow understanding? And this form is not only for psychology, this form is also for therapy. So we can say that it is a core psychotherapy process, and in many different schools of psychotherapy, mindfulness and this attention directing and attention sort of practicing process is present in number of schools of psychotherapy. And then we can say that there is lot of research going on. There is one publication after another in which this practice is being used, this interventions form is being used for different sort of problems, for both for stress and also as a therapy, and also for eating disorders, also for people who are having problems with drugs and all. And in this conference I learnt a lot that and there are a number of articles about mindfulness as a practice being used in school children. And I must admit that before I attended the conference and read some of the articles, I was quite skeptical. What can you do with 15-year-old children who are making noise in the class? How do you use mindfulness? What do they know about these eightfold paths? But some of the presentations in the conference showed that for some students it was bringing some sort of peace of mind. It was calming them down. It was bringing some sort of satisfaction in their life. And as one of the colleagues discussed with me, they said something is better than nothing. So it's not the whole package, but it's something. And what is my comment is that in order to have it effective, and I describe it in my article, there are so many points here, and if you are not following the other paths, if you want mindfulness to be very effective, then you have to follow some other paths also, and especially based on a master's dissertation published by unfortunately not published, but written by one of my students in Roskilde University. which use the phenomenological understanding of meditation and mindfulness. He himself is of Danish origin, but practicing meditation for a number of years. He interviewed number of experienced mindfulness. It was mainly meditation, those persons who were practicing meditation, and he said that for this practice to be effective, we have to remember that it cannot be just something you do once in a while. It has to become a part of your daily conduct. You have to do it regularly. It's not that you can just do it for a week or 2 weeks and then you say it should be effective. And secondly, what is important is also a good trainer. Good trainer, and this Kabat-Zinn in his seminal article from 94, he also brought out this concept that for these practices to be effective, there has to be a very good trainer, and the trainer himself or herself has to practice this. It's not just a technique. This is why the whole discussion comes to that, can we just use it as a simple technique? And here you can have different views. You can use it as a technique, then it's just something is better than nothing, a little thing is better than nothing. If you have that attitude, then you can use it as just a technique. But for this to be effective, to get something out of this, it has to be sort of done as a part of daily conduct. There has to be a teacher, experienced teacher, and you have to understand the conceptualizations, that what is the basis behind it. And so with this, what I'll point out, that you can see it in two perspectives. One is that see it as a narrow practice which brings about some sort of calmness, and for those who are not clinical patients. In everyday life also there is this concept of life quality improves, and also some social relationship. There are a number of studies which you can read about this in this journal. I am not going to quote them, but the main idea is that it can contribute to the life quality in some ways, and the other way is to look at mindfulness as a broader concept. And there, if you are following more of these, so it's not only the right mindfulness. You can see this is not right effort, right mindfulness, but if you are following the other path, and my student Alan Mason, yes, that was his name, he used this example that if you are not following the other paths, and if you are having a very restless life, and if you are not having enough sleep, if you are having very conflictual relationships and fights, and not eating properly and using intoxicants, and then if you use some time for mindfulness meditation and you sit and meditate for some time, you think it will be very effective? Will it be very effective? This mindfulness practices, if you are not, because all these other points are there, in some way or the other you have to follow these to get what you think you will get out of these practices too. And there are these discussions, but in many of these practices, not changing your life totally, but at least following some of these aspects is emphasized. And with this I come to the next part about this system, about yoga also, because it was really nice to notice that at least half of the persons sitting here have been for some yoga classes. And yoga is, it's both a system of knowledge, and yog is a Sanskrit word which means, yog means a linking or union. So it is the union of human beings to the super beings, to the superpower in some ways. So in some ways yoga is not only to get your body in place, it's not like just fitness, but it is more, it is this unity between mind and body and spirituality is practiced in this form of yoga. So it is about practicing using these bodily postures and concentration and discipline to get some sort of spiritual experience, or at least to come closer to the divine in some ways. So in some ways we can say that these practices have this basis, and if you do not use the full package, you can at least use some part of it. But what is happening in the last few decades, and this is Moodley and West from Canada, from Toronto University, they have written this excellent book about this meeting between East and West, and how some of these practices are coming back. And they say that in the past few decades, many of these traditional psychotherapy methods, they have come back in the West, though it is not a coordinated way, but they have come back in the West in some way or the other. So with this, we say what happens when we are combining these systems, what are the hindrances. Now I have gone into these details and giving you these examples. So my last part of the presentation will be about what are the hindrances when we are trying to bring these systems in. What are the hindrances and what can we do about it? Because being both in the world of theories and also in the world of intervention and practice, we will look at both how to promote collaboration, but we will look at the hindrances, what happens when we try to bring these in. And one of them is that, especially seen from the Western point of view, it is still a sort of, these are regarded as alternative practices. Isn't this the word one uses? That the main dominant paradigm is this natural science, the Western bioscience understandings, and the other systems become sort of alternative systems, and there's some sort of culture arrogance. There is not place for them, and it is this Western biomedicine which has a dominant position. And sometimes these other systems one belittles them, one sort of marginalizes them, and they are not given this respect. So this becomes a hindrance. And even now in the department I am teaching, these themes are not seen as real psychology, and I can't even teach this semester. I am not allowed, or there is no space there is no acceptance to teach this topic this semester in the university I am, which is supposed to be very open university, because in some ways they think, is it really psychology? Oh, she is talking of East, is there psychology in East, and what sort of understandings? And now some students come and say, we want to write about these topics. So you can see even in an open experimental workplace like Roskilde University, there is this sort of marginalizing and belittling of some of these topics. And there is this real situation, this real problem about there are different worldviews. There are different understanding of basic concepts like self, and how do you understand relationship between man and society. I try to show you in short form, and self-understandings, and even what is scientific. The whole discussion is about what is scientific. Is it scientific when you cannot conduct a random RCT, random control trial? If you cannot do this, is it scientific or not scientific? Or is science just, now I have to use the Danish term because I think it sounds so nice. I am teaching in this department of health science, and they have a big poster, KL molus of bias. KL thing molus of bias. Can you sort of measure everything? Can you weigh everything? And sometimes the things you cannot measure and you cannot weigh. And I showed you that human beings are capable of experiencing this meditative experiences, which cannot even be expressed in words. So isn't it a problem? If you cannot express in words, how can you measure it? And how can you weigh it? So it becomes a problem, what is science? And another issue is also about this simultaneity. In some ways, we have this cultural relativism that everything's equal, sort of everything's equally good. It has its own context, its own placing, so everything's equally good. But on the other side, when we are talking of this diffusion of knowledge, then we are also talking of this psychological universalism, that there is something common among human beings. We can understand each other across borders. So there is some sort of contradiction, but should we just sort of give it up? And if we don't give it up, what should we do? And what is being done already? And here I'll say that it's very important, and this I'm glad to get. This is Paranjpe is a psychologist of Indian origin who's lived for many years in Canada, and he's written this very good book about this meeting of East and West in psychological terms. So he says that uncritical acceptance of Western models in India may be as dangerous, because sometimes it's just terrible when I travel back and sometimes I read these articles. Some of these Western concepts are just like these group of scholars for 40 years back when I was studying psychology in India. They went to some village in India and they were trying to find Oedipus complex. They were studying children. They said Oedipus complex, why this child is not, I hope you all are familiar. I'm going on some other track, but I'm just saying, and they were trying to sort of bring this, yeah, and because the children, they were living in big joint families. They were like 20 people living in the family. There was 4 brothers and their wives and their children living together, and there was not that this sort of relation. It was another society, and you just can't force Oedipus complex on the children in a little village in India. This will be dangerous. So similarly, this is also dangerous. A naive fascination. I think I've written the spellings incorrect, but you understand the term. When you are really fascinated by these Eastern techniques of meditation and altered state of consciousness in the West. If you just bring these techniques in, and 2 years back in 2009, I was in India in July in Himalaya, and in McLeodganj, which is Dalai Lama's center, and there I saw so many people from the West, young people like some of you here, and they were, half of them were, you understand what I'm trying to say, these were drugs. They were in altered state of consciousness. This is a misunderstood form of being free in a way, and trying, instead of trying from meditation and from your own concentration, using drugs, charas, ganja and all these, I don't even know the names in Danish, these hash, lot of hash and some other harsher drugs than hash. So this is also a sort of misunderstood form of using these alternate, and now this is the second last, but it is possible, and this is why I'm standing here. This is why this exchange is going on. It is possible, collaboration is possible. It requires respect, it requires reciprocal respect, and not ethnocentrism, not to think that all what is European, all what is Western is just upstairs and downstairs, it's up there, all what is West and the rest. West has only the patent, the others don't have any sort of knowledge. So if there is this Eurocentrism, if you get over this Eurocentrism with this openness, and this Eurocentrism which is overriding, devaluing other systems, if you don't do this, if there is openness, then there is knowledge, there is this wisdom, there are understandings, deeper, more nuanced understanding, and not using this power, and also non-acknowledgement. So many times these processes, they are being taken without acknowledgement. Just like this master's dissertation, where it's Kabat Singh who has started mindfulness. So if you acknowledge and if you have this openness, then collaboration is possible, and also collaboration is possible if there is attention to the basic assumptions. And here comes a point which some of you will say, why she is going to the political arena. We have to understand this broad context, including the political powers. They are political interests. at the societal level which make some understandings more powerful than others. So we have to understand that also, to have collaboration at higher levels, and also this framework for patient mobility. But somehow patients themselves are using these systems. Even in Denmark now you can see there is so many persons who are using these so-called alternative behandler, they are called. So there is this need, and if there is this relationship between supply and demand, so, and there are some practices which have been accepted. When I came to Denmark in 1980, both acupuncture was regarded as something very exotic, Chinese system, and chiropractor. These practices were really sort of alternative practices. Now they have been included within this established system. So changes are taking place, and patients themselves should have the mobility, the possibility to choose these systems. And lastly, it's also pragmatism and ethical consideration. If somebody is suffering, and if you know that it will help, and this is where I think there is this place, I think I must stop soon. So this is the second last slide, and so the last one is about, so in some ways we should attempt to understand what the others understand, both for our own sake and even when we are trying to collaborate. So with this, the conclusion is that East and West orientations have different histories, and but it's still important to combine knowledge to understand the reality. We have to combine knowledge. There are certain processes, certain phenomena which are not being understood in the mainstream Western psychology, but there are also limits to how much we can combine and how we can combine. And secondly, there is also this nature of ethnocentrism in cross-cultural understanding. So we have to understand this cultural imperialism, and especially some of these medicine industries are so powerful in suppressing these biodiversity, we can say this diversity of treatments, and also this process of appropriation when you take some understandings and do not acknowledge them. It is happening in many times in our fields also. And lastly, there is this avoidance of uncritical and naive acceptance, what I presented you. So I just stop here by saying that a complete psychology, it includes scientific study also of intuitive modes. It's not only rational processes but also intuitive modes, and spirituality is something the world needs. Everything is not just rationality, and everything just can't be understood, weighed and measured. There are also other processes, and then there is this not two-way but multiple exchange to broaden, enrich and deepen understanding of human existence and behavior. And lastly, the East and West must unite to provide each other with what is lacking. So with this I stop here, and now the floor is open for comments, questions or anything, and we still have a quarter of an hour. And then as it was written, it sounded very, I don't know how many people do it, but this is very rare in such lectures when they say that tradition so auslutters all arrangement may inspire debate or existential gemütlichkeit på en nærliggende bevartning. So is it like like you go out and have a drink or something? I don't drink any alcohol. I hope they have some juice. I like to come. So any comments or? And you, nu kan vi måske komme over til dansk, fordi I er meget velkommen til at komme med jeres spørgsmål og kommentarer på dansk. Yeah.
I have one comment. That is, you had a citation from a Buddhist citation, I think, on the PowerPoint, was said something about mindfulness being cultivating a kindness of heart towards all sentient beings or something like that. I just want to bring attention to it, to like an example of how difficult it is to understand. Like, I mean, something very. It's okay. I have to reformulate the question. Stefan. No, I try it in English, please.
Okay.
I just noticed that that this concept of kindness of heart or compassion, the compassionate heart or something, it very often comes up in discussion of mindfulness and in discussion of Buddhism. And it's a very central concept, I think, to some of the Buddhist traditions. But here, one hindrance is that modern Western psychology don't really have this concept of heart.
Heart?
Yeah, they don't have a concept.
They have concept of heart.
Yeah, but what is it? A heart of is it a heart of compassion and kindness, or is it a heart of pumping blood?
Yeah, that we can discuss. But modern psychology has concept of heart. But this about compassion and this interconnectedness and being kind to others, I think in some ways it is there in many different religions, also in Christianity. In some form it is there, isn't it something, love thy neighbor or something like that? So I think at some level or the others, instead of looking at the differences in different sort of religious understandings, we can look at the similarities in different religious understandings, and there is this basic concept. But what is important, that this compassion doesn't have to be a very large scale sort of understanding as it is described. You can start in your near world, in the world around you, and be kind to the people who are around you. And so this can be done, and I think in some ways it is being done, because in some ways you can say that people are in the modern world, they are so self-centered, but still it is a very pleasant surprise when you see that collections are being made by NGOs like Red Cross, or when they collect money, people still, it is supposed to be economic crisis in Denmark or in the world at present, but still Red Cross is able to collect some millions of kronas. So in some ways this compassion, not maybe in this broad, very universal sense, but...
My point was just that I think that mainstream Western psychology only have a physiological concept of heart, and that is not what is spoken about here, right? It's a psychological concept of or a phenomenological concept of heart that's really used in Buddhism. I mean, in one text I read, it's defined very clearly that when the author says, when I speak of heart, it is a point in the middle of the chest, right in front of the spine. That is his concept of heart, right?
So that's a very narrow sort of concept, because...
Well, it's not a biomedical, it's not a physical conception, right? Yeah. It's a psychological conception or an experiential concept, right?
But I beg to differ, because even in some mainstream psychology, and at present I am supervising a project in the university about pro-social behavior. So there is still this concept of pro-social behavior and helping others. There are still these ideals of solidarity. Maybe they are just ideals in this wake of capitalism and neoliberalism. Maybe they are ideals, but still there are some ideals about pro-social behavior and this whole utopic idea about altruism. I don't know how you say it in Danish. Can you say it in? Næstekærlighed, yeah. See, so there are these ideas, maybe not in the same form, in same extent, but næstekærlighed is it?
Wouldn't that be a Christian concept? Or would it be
now I'm no expert on Christianity, so, but there are some sort of ideas in the society in some way or the other which coexist along with this capitalistic idea of amassing wealth and trying to be as rich as possible, but there is some sort of value to these concepts of nächtigkeit and altruism.
But is the project that you are advising on, is that a Danish-based project? Because you can say that pro-social behavior in Denmark is institutionalized in a way that it's not in other parts of the world.
Yes.
Because you were talking about capitalist society, but we have an institutionalized pro-social system in a lot of ways.
Yes, in some ways.
And that one might argue that that takes people's personal focus away from altruism because someone is taking care of being altruistic for you.
In some ways, but at the same time, Denmark has a record. It's through some of these projects like this I've learned. Denmark has a record in frivillig arbeit, how you say it, in volunteer work. At some level, so there are some paradoxes in the society we are living in. On one side, it's welfare society, and I think you're absolutely right. Living in different settings and traveling back to India, I can sit here and talk of all this compassion and what I see when I go back to India, 30% people living under abject poverty. So, and that way you can say that in Denmark, this welfare, this compassion, this sort of næstekærlighed, as you are talking, has been institutionalized. People are paying tax. Of course, it's a very complex issue, but what I'm trying to point out that although some mainstream Western psychologists have thought of heart just as a physiological organ and not about this compassion and kindness, but still in psychology as a discipline, there are sort of understandings, and one of the latest books of psychology I'm using about this pro-social behavior is bringing together theories of group work and pro-social behavior. So it is sort of having some place. So, yes?
I would like you to talk a little bit more about, there was a quotation of Rao, who said, mind is material but subtle, whereas consciousness is the knowledge side. I think maybe I shortened it a little, but would you talk a little more?
Yes, sure. And I'm glad you asked this because it's such a, I can't even bring it now, but I'll read a few lines from this book because it has puzzled me, and I must admit I was one of my colleagues has been kind enough to go through this PowerPoint with me yesterday, and he also was puzzled by this, and so I could show him today that it is in assumptive base of Indian psychology. He talks about Rao, explains that mind and consciousness are considered to be qualitatively different, and unlike consciousness, mind is assumed to be material but subtle. It is the interfacing instrumentality that is connected with consciousness at one end and with the body at the other end. That I have tried to say in my presentation, because mind is seen as an instrument which is connected to the consciousness at one end, and on the other end it is connected to the body. Mind seen as gateway, and one's reality connection is the tool of awareness. So mind is the tool of awareness, and it is like the gateway. It is the gateway and one's reality connection to the tool of awareness. So mind is sort of this organ of this instrument of awareness. And on one side, these are really complex concepts, but very important to understand. And this brings me to this question of yours about objects of consciousness. Then the consciousness itself becomes the object of study. But so it is the tool of awareness, but it is not awareness as such. And when the mind connects us with the world outside through the senses system, we have phenomenal awareness. when the connection is to consciousness, there is transcendental realization in the virtue of double function of mind. Humans, as conceived in the Indian tradition, have access to both different sources of knowing and being. One is transactional, involving mind's interface with the brain and sensory system, and the other is transcendental, connection with consciousness as such. So mind is sort of in between. On one side is consciousness, on the other side is the body. I hope it becomes more clear now. But it's not so simple to understand when you have just these terms, body and brain. And so all this mind and consciousness are sort of complex concepts. Yes, and there was somebody in the second last row. Pardon? Yes, I will be giving it. Yeah. Yes?
Det er ikke interessant, at du på det der seminar, eller hvad det nu var for noget om mindfulness, blev konfronteret med den der med mindfulness som selvteknologi.
Ja.
Ja, jeg synes, at på en eller anden måde står vi jo så netop lige præcis i sådan et dilemma mellem at se mindfulness som en selvteknologi, altså kan man sige en slags perfektion af selvet, også i en arbejdsmæssig sammenhæng og
lige præcis, ja.
Sammenhæng. Og så det der, du siger med at komme ud af selvcentreringen. Altså, jeg ser det næsten som to modsatheder. Det kan godt være, det er forkert, men sådan tænker jeg lige over.
Ja, men det jeg prøver at sige her, at okay, start på et punkt. Something is better than nothing. At man starter et sted, og så prøver at gøre det bedre. Giver det mening? At i stedet for bare ligesom afvise det totalt, fordi det kommer fra den exotic øst eller sådan noget. Så man siger, okay, der er noget om snakken, der sker noget, det kan være nyttigt. Og så i stedet for at følge bare det der etfold part, i stedet for at følge kun en vej, hvis man kan ligesom indtage flere aspekter, hvis man kan følge flere aspekter, så kan det være mere nyttigt.
Men jeg forstår godt, hvad du mener, og egentlig er jeg også enig i det.
Ja.
Men jeg tænker bare på, at i virkeligheden kan det jo misbruges som en slags selvteknologi, hvis det er det, man ønsker, det skal bruges til.
Ja, det.
Og så kan man sige, så er man måske lavet noget skridt den forkerte vej. Altså,
Ja, så er det ligesom mere harmful, ja.
Så er det mere harmful på sin vis. Eller det kunne det være, ikke?
Ja, men det der er ligesom vigtigt i den her sammenhæng, at det skal ikke være harmful, og så man skal ikke ignorere andre aspekter. Som der var nogle af de studerende, de ville skrive en opgave omkring mindfulness og inden for arbejdspladser. Så de siger, hvis der er meget stress, der er alt for mange krav på medarbejdere, og de har alt for mange pligter, og de er overbyrdet og sådan noget. Og så siger man, nu kan I have et kursus om mindfulness. Og er det rigtigt? Er det ligesom, så er det misbrug af det her. Fordi, og det jeg prøver at sige, det, hvis I kan huske, jeg ser også i min kritik af mindfulness, at bread kontekst, limitations are psychological reductionism, narrow individual focus. Og så det må ikke være på bekostning af nogle strukturelle aspekter. Man må ikke blive misbrugt, og der kommer flere og flere pligter, og flere ligesom mere og mere arbejdsbyrde. Og så siger man, nu får I det her kursus, eller I kan meditere i et kvarter, eller halv time, eller... Og det var noget, den studerende, som jeg var vejleder for i hans special, det var nogle store virksomheder, som jeg vil helst ikke nævne her i det, men nogle store virksomheder, som brugte meditation, og de havde nogle kurser, og der var der den der skepsis, både for professionelle side og også som medarbejdere side, dem der skulle undervise, de siger, hvad er det, der sker her? Og hvis de tror, at der kan ske mirakler ved at bruge 2 timer om ugen, eller sådan noget, det var i 3 timer om ugen med det her. Så er der, man skal også være på vagt, og man skal også tænke på de begrænsninger.
Ja. Men jeg kan også godt følge det, du siger, men lidt er nogle gange bedre i nye ting, fordi det, at vi begynder at snakke om, hvordan vi har det på arbejdspladsen, og vi begynder at gøre noget ved det, og vi begynder at være mindful, om ikke andet så i et stykke tid. Det gør jo så, det er måske startstedet til en større proces. Så det er måske, altså når man siger, jamen, hvordan bruges det, så skal det måske også ses som en del af en proces, hvor vi starter et sted, og giver nogle muligheder for nogle muligheder af det, ikke?
Både ja og nej, fordi hvis det kan være en del af en længere og mere kompleks proces, så det er fint, men hvis det bare stopper der, og så bliver det ligesom narsut, forstår I det? Ja, hvis jeg husker det rigtigt nu, mine børn er store, så kan jeg ikke. Men det kommer an på, hvordan det bliver ligesom brugt, så det kan lige netop blive brugt, og i det mindste, nu kan jeg ikke sige så meget om arbejdspladser, fordi jeg har ikke læst artikler om det, men de kapitler, der handler om børn, jeg kunne godt sige, at, og det var, nu kan jeg ikke huske, hvem har lavet det, en meget kendt studie fra Italy, hvor der var både skolelærer og børn, teenagebørn, som lærte, først de lærer, og der underviser lærte mindfulness, og så de prøvede at øve det regelmæssigt med børn, og de var begge parter var glade for det. Selv børn siger, at vi vil have mere af det, og der er også nogle artikler, jeg tror det er i Finland, i nogle skoler, de har prøvet, og så de havde ikke økonomi til mere, så det var børn selv, det var nogle teenagers, der vi vil have mere af det her, fordi det gavner, og der var det en del af den proces, som du siger. Så vi kan ikke sige kategorisk ja eller nej, det kommer an på, hvordan det bliver brugt, og om det fører til videreudvikling.
Kan du nå at sige nogle gange lidt om, hvordan man i den her østlige forståelse ser på et selv, kontra man gør i den vestlige? Altså fordi vi får nogle helt specielle konsekvenser for, hvordan man også...
Ja, jeg kan måske prøve at sige det, for det første er det, at det bliver meget blandet sammen. Vi må passe på med de her dikotomier nogle gange, fordi især med det her globalisering af mennesker og globalisering af viden. Nu hvem er jeg? Nu jeg har boet 25 år i Indien, 30 år. Har jeg en østlig selv eller en vestlig selv og sådan noget. Så hvis man passer på, men der er alligevel nogle træk på en eller anden måde, fordi der er en af de Miss Glasses bog er omkring selvet er fra Marcella, allerede i, jeg tror det var i 70'erne, vi kan tale om det der France senere, som siger, at selvet er ligesom den der social selv, at fokus er ikke på den afgrænsede enkelt person, men relationer har meget stor betydning. Det er ligesom, man tænker meget mere på de relationer, og så når man går lidt mere i den spirituelle forståelse, så det er ikke kun relationer med insignificant others, eller dem der er i nærheden, men også den relation, både med personer, men også relation med natur, og også med ens Gud. Der er, og især i hinduisme, i min egen religion, hinduisme, er der også meget med, hvordan man relaterer sig til Gud og de forskellige former af Gud, så det bliver en meget kompleks selvforståelse, hvor der er ligesom plads til mange relationer på mange forskellige niveauer. Og som ændrer sig også, der kan man også, hvis vi tager også den life course perspektiv, hvordan mennesker ændrer sig gennem et livsforløb, så de selvforståelser ændrer sig også i forskellige perioder af livet. Det er ikke noget nyt til at sige. Det sker i hele verden, fordi men der sker nogle radikale forandringer, fordi inden for de forståelser af livets forløb, livet er delt i 4 perioder. Ligesom brahmacharya først er, hvor man lærer at være kompetent og kvalifikation, så kommer grahast. Det er ligesom, når man er et familiemenneske, hvor man danner familie, og så kommer der, den tredje del kommer som vanprasthashram, hvor man siger, at vantrøst, at man psykisk set, jeg ser det på hindi, du kunne ikke forstå det ord selvfølgelig, men hvis jeg oversætter det på dansk eller engelsk, så det er ligesom, man psykisk trækker sig fra verden, og siger, at nu, og det livet er delt i 4, ligesom 100 år, selvfølgelig det er nogle ideal, så det første 25 år er brahmacharya, og den fase, hvor man er studerende og holder sig for sex og alt det her, og prøver at være kompetent. Der er ikke noget med kaster, eller og det. Og så fra 25 til 50 år, så er det ligesom det tilladt. Jeg ved ikke nu, når jeg har været i Indien og set de her templer i Khajuraho, hvor der er alle de der statuer med forskellige seksuelle stillinger. Og det er helt tilladt inden for de der 25 år til 50 års periode, når man er ligesom homemaker, når man etablerer sig og danner familie, så er det helt fint med seksualitet og forskellige former. Kama Sutra, det må I har hørt. Kama Sutra, det er den ældste bog om elsker og om seksualitet. Det er 3000 år gammel. Så inden for det her rammer er det tilladt. Og så har man også selve, det er ikke kun mig selv, men du har ansvar, personen har ansvar for sin partner og børn og for sine forældre. Og på den måde, selve bliver noget andet i den fase. Så kommer det, som hedder vantrøst, at du psykisk trækker sig fra verden. Og når det er psykisk tilbagetrækning fra verden, så er det ligesom, man vitterligt prøver at ligesom disengage, hvordan siger man det på dansk? Men ikke involverer sig så meget i verden og prøver at tænke, at nu skal jeg ligesom forlade verden. Og i den sidste del, så er det ikke kun psykisk, men bogstaveligt talt, man ligesom måske rejser til et helligt sted, eller bruger mister sin tid og energi på at blive til Gud og sådan noget. Så ændrer sig forståelse af selvet også, at nu er jeg ligesom, jeg forbereder mig til at forlade den her verden. Så bliver det forskelligt. Okay, så hvad siger vores organizer her? Ja. Okay.